Hey, good day, everybody. Dave Walker again here at Align 2021, our best SMB conference for the B to SMB Institute. And I invited a group of thought leaders to occupy basically our Wednesday morning of the event. And the one of them that I've been looking forward to greatly is a conversation with Roger Mader of Ampersand. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you very much, Dave. Pleasure to be here.
So I'm not going to be presumptuous. While everyone should know you and should know who you are, I'm not going to be presumptuous that everyone does. So if you wouldn't mind, give us a quick background on yourself and on Ampersand and kind of your areas of specialty.
Happy to do that. And to our audience, I will deprive no one of the joy of meeting me for the first time. So don't feel remiss if you've never heard of me.
Well played.
So again, it's Roger Mader. I'm based in New York City. I have a consulting firm called Ampersand, and we advise companies large and small on innovation. How do you better serve your customer by understanding their needs and developing solutions, products, services that better serve them? And my tagline is helping big companies act small and helping small companies get big. So it is a very B to SMB centric kind of model that we have. And my team is located around the world. We operate primarily virtually and assemble teams around the needs of our clients. And I work with, as I said, everything from startups to Fortune 500 size global companies.
Excellent. So not surprisingly, I wanted to invite you to talk about the subject of innovation. And based on the premise that I think we, particularly in the executive ranks of large brands, and I will count myself among them, I used to be one of those, we have a certain amount of conceit that we understand what innovation is and how innovation works. And in some cases, I would say the innovation that we're credited with, we were just damn lucky. It wasn't a lot more than that. I will raise my hand and say I am that person. But that said, I wanted you to really kind of, from your perspective, give us a playbook on innovation, and no better starting point than to say, what do you define as innovation?
Yeah, thank you. It's a fair question. So just to kick that off, there's a distinction between innovation and invention. Invention is about fundamentally creating something new out of rudimentary sciences, which requires years and research labs, et cetera. Innovation is mostly about assembling solutions out of existing technologies, capabilities, et cetera. So to begin with, innovation is different from invention. It's more immediate, it's more tangible, it's more actionable, and it's creating something new of value. Invention creates stuff that's new that may or may not be of value. And it tends to be kind of the raw material for later innovation. Innovation says, there's a problem in the world, how can I solve it? And traditional problem solving simply tries to fix what's broken. What innovation does, and I'll describe the method for you to answer the second half of your question, is that it doesn't presume the break. It says, let's start from scratch and understand the need more definitively. So how do you go about it? 4 phases. I try and keep this as simple as possible. Define the challenge. Four Ds, by the way. Define the challenge. Discover the need in the surrounding context. Design alternative ways to solve that problem, and then ultimately deploy the best of those. So define means that, we say there's a gap in the world. I'll give you an example. I worked with one of the pizza companies, and they said, hey, we need $500 million net new revenues within the next 3 years. Can you help us design a new pizza? And by the way, we've tried friggin' everything. We put macaroni and cheese on a pizza. We put chocolate chips on a pizza. And by the way, we have to sell it in Walmart and other big boxes that require it to be in a pizza box because that's the shelf it fits on. And you can't put an egg on it. Then it's a breakfast, and you can't put chocolate chips on it. We tried that, and that's a dessert. We are a dinner aisle item that has to be in a pizza box. So basically it can be a crust, tomato sauce, and cheese in this box. And we've tried everything. Go. And the way that you might go about that as a natural sort of act is just to kind of start trying different things and test it with consumers, see what works. Using the using an innovation method, what you would do is say, let me go back to the source and understand the need. And in discovering the needs of moms serving pizza, and it tended to be people playing the mom role, regardless of their gender, somebody who's responsible for providing a dinner time meal to their family,
Right.
was the target audience. There's sort of, plenty of college kids who are eating pizza too. They weren't the problem. Moms expressed guilt. I feel guilty serving pizza more than on Friday nights, even though everybody likes it. It's easy, and it's actually got a nutrition profile that's better than some of the other stuff that I could do. I feel guilty doing it because it's too easy, because it's not mine, because it's frozen, blah, blah. So that we were able to act on that. That was one line of understanding. Then the other thing is to do an understanding from the marketplace of where in the world are frozen foods better than fresh. And you would find people would tell you, well, strawberries out of season. I buy those frozen because, I use them in these ways because there isn't a fresh alternative. Or in Paris, you will find that there is a luxury food brand that's all frozen because it's a culture of people who revolve around a 3-hour dinner that takes 2 hours to prepare.
Mm-hmm.
But in the advent of a working world where women are as employed as men, there's no one at home to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's again a sense of guilt, like we're not fulfilling. So you can go into this place at eye-watering prices and buy everything from the baguette to the 3-course meal, and throw it in the oven and produce basically a beautiful meal in 20 minutes that can be suffice to fulfill their cultural needs. So we found indicators that you could solve for this. We found the need to be solved for, created 6 different prototype ways you could solve it. Everything from you'd open the pizza box and a bunch of profiterole would come out. Imagine little frozen dough balls filled with mozzarella. You bake those in the oven just like you would a pizza. They become this bubbly, crispy, hot joy.
Mm-hmm.
And you then, and meanwhile you're melting the tomato sauce and the mozzarella and putting that on the top. And it was delicious. It was the best solution as far as I was concerned. And as a guy who can tell you about pizza, it was a great solution. And it was kind of fun. It was different. I hadn't seen it anywhere else. But it failed because the manufacturing costs were too high. They'd have to really turn over a line to produce frozen balls of dough. What ended up being deployed, and I won't say the brand, but you can go out and find it in the world, was the design a pizza kit. And you open up the box and you got 3 pizza crusts in the middle and different ingredients on the outside. Because the pivotal action we found when we discovered moms felt guilty was that they reduced their guilt when they customized their pizza. When they sprinkled oregano on it, or put their own cheese on it, or oh, I've got this this pepperoni I'll slice and put on here. Then it kind of was their pizza, and the guilt wasn't eliminated, but they could make it the pizza they wanted. So now imagine you open up a pizza box, and everybody gets to make their own pizza, and it is becoming your own meal. You're crafting it together as a family, or you're producing it as individuals, or you can make 3 different pizzas for yourself. And when we tested it, it totally addressed this concern. Like all of a sudden now, this is a way for us to make dinner together, rather than this is mom copping out on making dinner. So that process was understand, define the challenge, 500 million in the next 3 years, study the need and potential solutions to address that need, iterate multiple prototypes, test them, figure out what can be deployed successfully to meet the goal, take that to market. And
it's a great story. I mean, I think it's illustrative of how processes really are the underpinning of the most successful innovation. It isn't lightning in a bottle. It isn't, I mean, on occasion it certainly can be, but that more oftentimes, I guess you would probably say that's more often invention. It's just this flash of brilliance, and this is what I envision something to be. You're talking about a much more meticulous process and really kind of taking yourself down a decision tree that ultimately arrives at the. And it's funny because as you were talking, I was thinking, God, what the hell would the pizza be?
Yeah,
because it's not like there's any shortage of pizza variations.
No,
but
it's true.
But taking it from the perspective of, hey, I want to create a pizza that really helps the dinner maker feel less guilty. about something too easy is fascinating. So
Yeah.
is there a jumping around a bit here, but is there a culture around the most successful innovative companies? And preceding that is, who would you count as some of the most successfully innovative companies out there?
Using the definition of innovation I just did,
Mm-hmm.
many of us will know off the top of our heads companies that we admire. And very
Mm-hmm.
often when you admire a company, it's because they're serial innovators.
Mm-hmm.
Apple is always comes up as one of the top companies on that list who serially innovate,
Mm-hmm.
but they never invent. Apple is almost always second or third to market.
Mm-hmm.
Everything they do is not the first one. It's just the
Mm-hmm.
best one.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they're doing is something rudimentary about the innovation process that's better than the way
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft and others do it. They're direct
Mm-hmm.
competitors, or Samsung, whoever, depending on the category. Um, so yes, there is a culture that cultivates innovation, and it is as deliberate as a culture that cultivates quality.
Mm-hmm.
So, many of our audience will understand what it means to produce a quality product requires a deliberate method, clear metrics, repeatability, measurability, accountability, all of the sort of best practices of doing anything repeatably. And innovation can be exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm.
What I want to just refute the model that most of us have about the eureka moment, that the lone genius who comes up with the idea. Even in instances where Newton gets hit on the head with an apple and realizes gravity must be drawing that thing to the ground, it comes after years of research and exploration and conversations with other academics from other fields of science, et cetera, for that insight to come together. When you and I have a flash of brilliance, in the shower or wherever you get your inspiration that is a big idea of the moment, if you track it back, it's almost never something that has spontaneously germinated out of your own genius. It's
Mm-hmm.
because it's been troubling you for a while and you've been freaking thinking about it and
Mm-hmm.
probably talking to people and looking at alternatives and tried 5 things that didn't work. You have been haphazardly doing the process of innovation.
Mm-hmm.
What we're trying to do is just make it predictable. How
Mm-hmm.
can you compress the time? If I have to wait for eureka moments, I never know if I'm going to be able to innovate. So
Right.
I have to create a mechanism to be able to do it. And if you go study the people who do it well, like Apple, they are incredibly consumer centric or user centric. They have a method for understanding need, and they have a method for designing to serve it. And
Mm-hmm.
Steve Jobs was very deliberate about the challenge of technology is that it's highly complex. It's designed by engineers as though everyone is an engineer, using clumsy language and making things way too complex. So he had a design ethic that said, we're going to simplify complexity.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not simple enough for a child to use, we're not doing it right.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why he studied laboratories, research labs in the 1980s, even the 70s, to be able to assemble the components that became the first graphical user interface that you and I enjoy today,
Mm-hmm.
which was not developed by Apple. It was designed by Xerox.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
they had it in a research lab and weren't commercializing it. And he was like,
Mm-hmm.
this is what we've been waiting for, a computer that
Right.
can draw, not one that
Right.
can just count. Um, so, you also have to have a deliberate intention to be looking for it. And if you don't know the problem you're trying to solve, you don't know what to look for. So
Mm-hmm.
the method is the madness. You've got to find the way to serially solve these challenges. I shouldn't say serially because a lot of it's iterative because you test and test and test.
Is there any difference in the process that you ascribe in the innovation of a product versus a service?
Technically, no, because both of them are a product. In any case, you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
solve a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe you can solve it with a hammer, or maybe you have to solve it with a carpenter because it requires hammer plus talent, and I can't give you talent, so I got to give you a carpenter. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of developing a hammer, I'm going to develop a service that allows you to find a TaskRabbit to find a carpenter. So it starts with understanding that problem, and then when you get to the solution, you can say, it just requires the force of a hammer that anyone can use. Hammer will do, or it requires hammer plus expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I could do hammer with an instructional video. Maybe I
Mm-hmm.
could do a hammer that's in a frame that, you can't go wrong. Maybe
Mhm.
it's an automated hammer. Maybe it's not a hammer. Maybe it's a pile driver that's automated.
Mhm. Mhm.
So you have to, and you get to that solution by iterating. So
Mhm.
I don't even want you to presume that it's a product or a service until you've figured out the problem.
Right. Great
Yeah.
point. Great point. So you believe that innovation is most critical in times of crisis, or in times of great change. Why?
Well, anytime the world shifts, anytime the ground underneath you shifts, you basically have to find a new way to balance yourself.
Hmm.
And innovation is often it may not even be correct for me to think of it as, in times of change, innovation is essential. I think what happens is, in times of change, it's more prolific, right?
Hmm.
Because the rules have changed and you got to start over.
Hmm.
Um, and those who succeed are those who understand the change and can adapt. And those who
Hmm.
fail, it's quite Darwinian, either fail to understand the change or adapt poorly.
Hmm.
And it requires both, right? Understand the
Hmm.
change, then do the adaptation and succeed in doing so. And the
Hmm.
innovation method is just a productive way to achieve that.
Hmm.
Something changes, and if you're trained in this method, you say, huh, what's changed? Why did it change? Who changed it? Let me diagnose this
Right.
challenge.
Right.
And then you have to avoid this notion. We have a really broken phenomenon in the human species. We're a poorly evolved monkey. We really are. Like, what I mean by that is, just to step back for a second, one of the things that's a fundamental problem, and I'm afraid, my friend, it's worse for you and me, because for some reason I observe that men are a bigger problem in this regard than women. Um, and it is simply empathy. It is that I wake up in the morning and I think I'm hungry and I think about feeding me.
Hmm.
I am a self-centered monkey. And I probably wouldn't be on the planet if I wasn't interested in feeding myself. So you can imagine, evolutionarily, it's not a bad thing. But what
Right.
happens is, when you jam all these people who spent 400,000 years living in small tribes and slam them into these large, concentrated, dense communities, even
Hmm.
cities down to small villages are much bigger an aggregation than humans were evolved to live in. We don't trust each other. We're tribal.
Hmm.
All of which is to say that we think about ourselves first, and that is a terrible way to innovate, because you kind of think, how I make hammers, how do I sell more hammers?
Hmm.
And you do these very simple calculations. That's me focused. I push hammers. How do I push more hammers? And what happens is, you start selling people hammers who have got a screw they need to screw in, or
Hmm.
who would be better served with wood glue than with a hammer and a nail. Because
Hmm.
everything, the old saw is that if you make hammers, everything's a nail, is true, because you're serving yourself,
Hmm.
not your customer.
Hmm.
One profession that is trained to do the inverse, well, the obvious one that we all interact with, is your family doctor.
Hmm.
If you have a doctor who's working for the drug company and trying to sell you drugs,
Hmm.
you very quickly do not trust that doctor.
Right.
That doctor uses the innovation method. You walk in, they say, what are we trying to do here today? Well, my back aches. They then diagnose your back to figure out what's causing the ache. And then, because there's not the science is uncertain, even the diagnosis is probably uncertain, we're going to try a few things. So take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning. If that didn't work, then we might end up doing surgery at some point. Um, but the method is to diagnose, prescribe, test, resolve. And we're doing the exact same thing, just outside of the medical field. It starts with empathy, understanding the need, understanding the pain as your starting point.
I think that's a fascinating point, and I think that again, I would as I tally in my mind those leaders that I consider to be the most innovative, their ability to discover is primarily driven by their empathy. Is that they really do feel and understand actually quite well the problems that other people have,
Yep.
and they internalize that, turn it into their own, and then they suddenly are solving for it. There was much written in this last year and a half about pivots, Pivot suddenly became an incredibly popular word to just be dropped in all sorts of situations. And I just, from your perspective, is a pivot an innovation? Is a pivot made more powerful by using an innovation process? Just talk for a minute, if you would, about the pivots that happened over the course of this last year.
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying I'm not here to sell innovation, because I think innovation is often not required, and it's
Mm-hmm.
expensive and it's risky, and you should use it when you need to use it. So
Mm-hmm.
you pivot when you're running a straight line and there's a wall in front of you. And
Mm-hmm.
oh, I need to pivot, and hopefully you see the wall before it breaks your nose. And oftentimes in times of crisis, the wall just appears while you're running full blast. So
Mm-hmm.
the pivot, um, the ideal is to have some lead time for your pivot so you can get around that wall. Then the question is, what's the right way to pivot? And I think so often we have a knee-jerk reaction. We do the first thing, not the best thing. We do the
Mm-hmm.
obvious thing, not the best thing. So when COVID hit, we had a pretty major transformational moment where humanity went from being three-dimensional to two-dimensional, and we're interoperating through screens ever since.
Mm-hmm.
And my guess is that we have propelled society by at least 5 years in its adoption and use of sophisticated technology as a communication vehicle. So there will end up being benefits to this exercise, this pivot that we've all had to go through. But it wasn't easy. We saw all kinds of groups have to pivot. Now, I don't think they all had to innovate.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is when your obvious pivot, which is almost never innovation, is to just turn right, and you realize that's not going to get you around the wall. They have to stop and reconsider and think judiciously about what can I do to address the challenge in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you apply this innovation method. You say, well, let me better understand the challenge. Let me understand my options, and let me practice and try a couple of examples.
Now,
So
you've written quite a bit on the restaurant industry in New York, and you kind of
yeah,
observed it through your eye as an innovator over the course of the last 18 months. Um, Many of the adaptive changes that restaurants, not just in New York, but probably around the country, made were, I would characterize like you did, is it was the first solution that they came up with. I'm
yeah,
going to put plexiglass up between all of these. I'm going to see people outside. I'm going to just try to get as fast as I can, the most expedient way possible, to a stopgap solution.
mhm,
Um, as particularly businesses are now in recovery or trying to energize their recovery, do they in some ways owe it to themselves to step back on a lot of these kind of stopgap fixes that they've made and more think about, no, what's the real true innovation required in the future of the restaurant business? Because you know it's not that plexiglass separators and bar-coded menus are a bad thing or are not sustainable. It just feels like, I think, for all of us who are, who frequent restaurants, this just doesn't quite feel right yet. And I don't pretend for a minute that we all have to go back to the way restaurants were. How, first of all, is that a fair observation? But more importantly, how do you apply innovation to the recovery that so many businesses are attempting to go through right now?
I think it's a great question. I like that you've picked up on the restaurant industry, because it's one so many of us are familiar with
Mm-hmm.
as consumers, and saw it have to go through this monumental, almost immediate change in order to survive. It's such a cash flow uh,
Mm-hmm.
dependent business that you go down for 5 minutes and they can go out of business. And we saw a lot of them go out of business. And right before the pandemic hit, by the way, I had the privilege of serving as the chief marketing officer for Subway, the world's largest restaurant brand. So I had a really
Mm-hmm.
deep interest in the success of. They were a client of mine who asked me to help out in transforming the company, and the marketing role was kind of the consumer-facing role that I got to play. The pandemic hit just as I was finishing in that position, and I had been immersed in the restaurant industry now, kind of for the first time in depth. And I live in New York City, which is restaurant rich. So
Mm-hmm.
I immediately saw the population of the streets that had, depopulated by cars, no longer going
Mhm.
to offices, people
Mhm.
fleeing the city. All of a sudden, the restaurants were taking over sections of the street in front of them.
Mhm.
And I discovered from a friend of mine in the industry that the city, New York City in particular, had really gone out of the norm to work
Mhm.
with the restaurant industry because it employs so many people. It's
Mhm.
so vital to the sort of lifeblood of the city that they broke all their own rules and just announced to the restaurants through the restaurant association, you can just take over the space in front of your building.
Mhm.
Leave this much room on the sidewalk. Take no more than 8 feet of the roadway in front of you. If there's a fire hydrant, you can't do this. Just a couple of rules, and just follow these rules and do whatever the heck you want. And we'll eventually get someone around to certify it.
Mhm.
But as long as you're in keeping with these rules, which is incredibly, uncommon in
Right.
the bureaucracy of
Right.
governance, for them to say this is an emergency. Let's invert all the rules.
Right.
You do it until we say no, not the reverse.
Right.
So that was a fundamental governance innovation, if you will, regulatory innovation.
Mhm.
And then what was interesting was to see the array of madness that showed up in the streets.
Mhm.
And my first reaction to it was, oh my God, somebody's going to get killed here. Because,
Yeah.
they look like plywood shanties for the most part. And either someone was going to get killed when the weather turned and they started enclosing them, totally defeating the idea of an open air space to eat.
Right.
Um, or a bus was going to come around a corner in a slushy street and go right through a crowd of people
Right.
surrounded by nothing more than plywood. So, partner and I started working with the restaurant industry in New York to talk about how you create sustainable structures,
Mhm.
and introduced a solution of using um, prefabricated, basically what you know as shipping containers.
Mhm.
So, a steel box, and you can easily just cut out the sides of it, and it will protect against that bus coming through it. It'll knock it down the
Mhm.
street, but it won't run you over. But it's also, you can get it up, you can move it, you can it's transportable,
Mhm.
it's sustainable. You can turn it back into a shipping container at the end if you choose to.
Mhm.
So there were lots of, and that was just one idea, but there's a number of different solutions. But what I wanted to point out was, in that pivotal moment, what was necessary was survival. And
Mhm.
people were doing all kinds of stuff. That was just one.
Mhm.
That was serve people outdoors. The other
Mhm.
big one that really helped to accelerate Subway, by the way, was to
Mhm.
really amp up digital ordering and delivery,
Mhm.
which had been, because Subway was on every street corner, Subway had been very slow about, let's make sure that we can do delivery, had been subverted by the introduction of Jimmy John's, which is, if you're
Mhm.
familiar with, a sub sandwich that kind of specializes in getting to you fast. I
Mhm.
swear to God, you haven't even hung up the phone from ordering those things, and there's the doorbell's ringing.
Mhm.
So I was jealous of that feature of theirs.
Mhm.
And to do it, they had to not not toast things. Like, there were a lot of trade-offs they had to do
Mhm.
to serve that feature, and they could win the market with the preferred feature. So one of the other big pivots was, much like schools had to do, is figure out how to go digital. How do you go digital with food? I can't push
Mhm.
that through your screen, but I can get it to you. I can understand your order. I can do the equivalent of QR codes, in order to ensure that I can keep my restaurant operating. A friend of mine runs Nathan's Hot Dogs.
Mhm.
Brilliant guy, and he decided what he was going to do was open ghost kitchens. So what he had was lots of facilities that were no longer able to serve as restaurants, but
Mhm.
they had all the cooking operations. So basically, what he did was rented out the spaces to do the cooking on behalf of multiple kinds of brands, and then create a distribution network. So his business doubled in size during the pandemic because he created an alternative use for the assets he had to
Mhm.
fulfill a new need. An amazing pivot. Amazing pivot. He's still growing ghost kitchens now around the world. It's
It's
incredible.
a it's just a and would you characterize that as innovation?
Yes, I would. So, read, it didn't exist.
Right.
So you say, here's a problem. I need to
Mhm.
solve it. What are the ways I could do it?
Mhm.
I could do delivery. I could do digital ordering. I
Mhm.
could do outdoor dining. I could,
Mhm.
all of which are an innovation that were, not in place to solve that problem before. I could, even more dramatic, I could kind of change my business entirely and use my assets to
Mhm.
serve a different audience for different brands, and maybe even make more money for them.
Mhm.
That's a pretty amazing pivot. That's a real innovation. That's saying, how do I take my
Right.
asset and
Right.
redeploy it because of a changing environment to a new profit model?
So I agree. We're all monkeys, and in many cases we're lazy monkeys. And I think that as many as many leaders had the impulse to innovation as we progress through maybe the first 6 to 9 months of the pandemic, I think it was interesting to see the turn towards more, let's go back to the way things were before the pandemic. Let's focus on operationally what we can do to reproduce as closely as possible to what we had before the pandemic started. And that ran from everything from let's re-engage large office space to bring everybody physically back to work 5 days a week, 40 hours in the chair, and on and on. It went on and on. And let's sell our products exactly the way that we used to. Let's get our street sales force back out on the street. Let's, add the features and benefits of products at a certain cadence, et cetera, et cetera. What is um, your message to all of those who are charged with the strategies and of large enterprises to say, wait a minute, guys, stop, step back, be brave, don't be a lazy monkey, be brave, innovate? Is help me articulate that
You
message.
just answered
How
my
would you?
question. That was beautiful. I think the right way to think of it is you could miss an opportunity,
Okay.
right? Fate has given me the option to be better.
Mm-hmm.
And now I can just say, oh, let me go back to my origin.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could say, how do I take advantage of this change?
Mm-hmm.
You know, Nathan's Hot Dogs is going to keep having ghost kitchens, and it
Mm-hmm.
might end up being the most profitable part of their business, because they saw a pivot, they redeployed an asset, they made more money, could grow with much lower costs because they're not having to brand everything. They're literally just boxes that cook stuff, and they can be on every street corner and they can ship food out to multiple brands. So the for them to then say, "Oh, we're out of pandemic, let's close that up,"
Mm-hmm.
would be foolhardy,
Mm-hmm.
because they already created something better. I
Mm-hmm.
think many businesses have recognized, particularly you see it among the digerati out on the West Coast, that this hybrid environment or this digital environment has huge advantages. We've
Mm-hmm.
got reduced traffic, we've got reduced commute time, we've got just a lot of reduced wasted effort. It ain't helping the airlines much because we also have reduced our business travel considerably.
Mm-hmm.
But, imagine that there's a pandemic and somebody invents the telephone.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I need to communicate. Hey, there's an electronic way to do that. After the pandemic, you don't go back to writing letters.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we should say, what are the new pivots that have proven value and success and capabilities that reduce our costs, increase our
Mm-hmm.
effectiveness, et cetera, and figure out how to adapt those. I am sure that you're going to see in many of the emptied out offices from the pandemic a lot of refitting for those to become residences, for example, and other
Right.
mixed use applications, because it just doesn't make sense for everybody to come back in the office when it's this much more efficient otherwise.
Right. Right. I appreciate the way that you framed it as an opportunity, and I would guess that you would define you would say that that step one of defining the problem could also be written as define the opportunity, and
Absolutely right.
could
Well
be
said.
just as expansive, really, and
Yeah.
in what it in how it works. um I could go on for hours with this, but my last question is really, from your perspective of being a close observer of innovation, something very hotly debated amongst product developers in our world, amongst brand strategists, marketing types. Um, does innovation, and you can be as specific in the B2B space as you want to be, but just more broadly stated, is innovation on a track in the next 10 years to be more convergent, where successful innovation is really about driving things together, or is it going to be more divergent, where things are going to really start to fan out to, and I can think of 1,000 different ways in which they might fan out, but just take that thought.
It's
What do you see?
it's funny that you use those terms because innovation is often described as a series of convergences and divergences.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is I literally draw that four-stage method: define, discover, design, deploy,
Mm-hmm.
as defining. You're coming in narrowly. Sorry, I'm trying to show my hands. You're coming together like through a funnel
Mm-hmm.
to say, of all the possibilities, what's the defined challenge I'm going to go after.
Mm-hmm.
Then in discovery, you go wide again and say, what are
Mm-hmm.
all the different ways that people are addressing similar problems? What are the precedents in history? What are the
Mm-hmm.
analogous acts that have taken place in other parts of the world? So you're gathering this broad array of data to inform your possible solution. Then you start creating prototypes and narrow down to the best of those. And then to
Mm-hmm.
deploy, you go wide and take over the marketplace. So, the method is a series of convergences and divergences. But to
Mm-hmm.
answer your question properly, I think it is a little the same in that in various domains, it's a little the same in that it's both.
Mm-hmm.
There are areas where there will be convergence, right? And
Mm-hmm.
typically it's around the emergence of a new technology or capability and its use case as people kind of refine it converges in much the same way that you and I are talking through a video medium right now, Zoom, I think today. Um, we will see greater and greater convergence around a smaller number of working platforms as it forces a new standard.
Mm-hmm.
And when it does, there's benefits in that standard because it improves more readily. And with any network, you want that network effect of multiple people have access to it. So you'll see convergence where convergence makes sense. But mostly with innovation, you see divergence, meaning we are incredibly capable now today in a way we haven't been prior to the 21st century to
Mm-hmm.
personalize,
Mm-hmm.
to customize to the individual.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I really appreciate about Jeff Bezos from the origin story of Amazon was he had this vision that we were going to become the world's most customer-centric company. From his
Mm-hmm.
very first analyst call, from his very first employee meeting, world's most customer-centric company. Not we're going to be the world's biggest bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be a Trojan horse for becoming the world's biggest everything store.
Mm-hmm.
Not at all. Didn't even care what they sold first. That
Mm-hmm.
books just happened to be an easy point of entry. He cared about the data and saying, how can we gather enough information about humans and their behaviors for it to become predictive so that I can
Mm-hmm.
anticipate based on what Dave bought in the last 6 months, I know what
Mm-hmm.
he's going to want to buy next. And I
Mm-hmm.
can track the things that match his purchase behaviors and recommend to him new products that would fit his profile. And
Mm-hmm.
they're friggin' right most of the time
Mm-hmm.
because it's just predictive data.
Mm-hmm.
What that means though is by the use of this massive data, they're able to serve you as an individual, to direct
Mm-hmm.
products to you. And because of things like additive manufacturing, soon enough, they'll be able to make it for you. Not
Mm-hmm.
like, embossing a shirt for you. Now I can emboss a car for you. So I think we're going to see greater and greater divergence because the technology allows us to personalize and customize to individual preference.
Yeah, one could argue, and you certainly see this in the CRM platform world, is that technology to assist in personalization, which is obviously divergent, is actually converging.
Yeah,
The
the
technology
tool
to do it,
converges. Yeah.
the tools to do it are actually narrowing and narrowing down to, yes, there is both methodology and math and hardware that does this basically and can assist in it.
Yeah.
Fascinating conversation, man. I really appreciate it. I would love to have you back. We do a conference near the beginning of the year where a big piece of the agenda is on innovation, what's coming in 2022. Would love to have you back for that and dive into even kind of deeper application of methodology, but also observation of who's clearly positioned to kind of take advantage of the opportunity. Are they really maximizing their innovation potential, given the opportunity? As I know is a conversation I'm sure you see going around executive committee tables all across the B2B landscape.
Absolutely.
So again, thanks for doing this. I very much appreciate it.
Dave, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
Take care, my friend.